Uh,
Okay.
we we've been talking for a little bit, and you have some fascinating views on sort of connecting across spaces, across time. And you and I both spent lots of time in Zoom as a result of teaching during the pandemic and going from place to place. So just wanted to continue that conversation if you'd like to for a little bit.
Sure, sure. I mean, for me, one of the things that was interesting about the pandemic was watching watching everything shut down.
Hmm.
Um, but watching things shut down from the perspective of being an anthropologist who spent a lot of time, just interacting and being embedded amongst creative people. So
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
would literally spend days at different comic creators studios just to like get a sense of like not just the there's the stuff that we talk about, but there's the stuff that we don't talk about,
Hmm.
and to get a sense of things like what is their source material,
Yeah.
but also what's it like, and that would lead to really fun things like I'll never forget being in Rob Stahl's studio, and he was doing an inking project, and he started in the afternoon, and he was inking and I was watching him ink, and we talked for a while, and then we got silent because there was nothing left to talk about, and there was just me watching him ink and ink dry. And
Yeah.
then things went dark, and I woke up the next morning. He was kind enough to put a little blanket over me. but but yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's not just about understanding technique, but it's
Hmm.
about the feel of it. It's about communing with someone else's boredom, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Hmm. Hmm.
Understanding pace, getting a sense of like of what it's like to be in a place. It's like the stuff doesn't always come at the same time. What do you do to kill time in between? I mean, another person that was really interesting. I was really grateful to spend a lot of time with Walter Simonson in his studio.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I mean, seeing how the life of the studio integrates with the life of the home, all of that. So, the pandemic happens and everybody's working from home, and I thought it was just really interesting because there were a lot of comic creators who I knew who on paper you would think that they would adjust most easily to it,
Hmm.
but what people don't realize is that people who work mostly from home usually have third spaces that they go to help them keep their sanity.
Yes.
And those were the things that shut down, right? Then you've got people who've never worked from home before, and they don't know how to manage that side of it, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and it's a learning curve for everything. I mean, you know, as I was doing my research, like that one of the conclusions I came to after being in a lot of people's studio and talking about like what their work life was like and what their home life was like was that probably um the single biggest thing that seemed to positively influence people's level of production and consistency of work
Hmm.
was was having an office or a studio with a door that closed.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And I know that sounds like something really small, but you start to realize like how big it is, right? That ability to kind of shut off from the house and also about having that workplace kind of respected by the other denizens of your dwelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and it's real. You know, um, I'll never forget one of the most interesting moments was I was at the Simonson's house, and Walter works in the studio downstairs, and Louise worked in an office upstairs.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I remember, like, Walter was taking a break, and he was like, let's go for pizza. And of course, I was like, yeah, let's go for pizza. And I remember like thinking, oh wait, we should see if Louise wants pizza, right? But I
Hmm.
started to walk towards the in the direction of her office, and he looked at me and he turned like white as a sheet. He's like, we don't. Nobody bothers Louise when the door's closed, right? And I was like, oh, you know what I mean? And this is just
Yeah.
like this seems like a really like stupid thing, but then I started to think about it afterwards. I'm like, oh, yeah. I mean, this is, I started to, yeah, I really started to see that. So fast forward to the pandemic, and I'm like thinking to myself, oh my gosh, all of these people with workspaces that don't have doors that close and their family
Yeah.
is around. This is not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, yeah. But we were fortunate enough to be renting a house that had kind of an upstairs space with like a sun porch that was closed in and stuff. But even after that, when things could be lifted somewhat, the emotion of that space had changed for me. It was kind of a relaxing room before, and because it was a room where all sorts of Zoom meetings happened for hours and hours, I would walk in and kind of feel like more tense.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And again, that's why that it's not just having an office. It's that door means something.
Hmm.
It's also that emotional separation, right?
Hmm.
Um, you know, we don't talk enough about those kinds of things. We're just kind of like, oh, you have a desk and you have Wi-Fi, so boom,
Hmm. Hmm.
or just because somebody can get work done in a coffee shop, usually the work that they do in that coffee shop is some specifically selected work that they get done well in a coffee shop.
Hmm. Hmm.
So some people might be really good at tuning out to do data entry in a coffee shop, and other people might be like, I need to be in a place that's totally quiet with no distractions,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of stuff, and I think that we don't think enough about it. And I know this is a comic podcast, so
Oh,
we
no,
don't have
no,
to
it's
talk about offices the whole
it's
time.
interesting. It's interesting. This is a place we haven't been to really talk about kind of the studio spaces, so it is interesting. But uh, yeah, I am curious about, as an anthropologist, what led you to comics, because I know there's ethnography that's been done. There are all sorts of texts that people can look at. So I'm curious about how comics became a part of your focus.
I think it was kind of the other way around, actually.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So, I mean, I like to say I grew up on comics. I had a mother who, well, I still have a mother.
yes.
she was, when I was young, she was an ESL teacher.
Oh,
My
nice. Uh-huh.
father was an executive for a recycling company, and both of them played a large part in my developing love of comics. The first time I really remember comics, I mean, my mom would read them occasionally to me, but one of my earliest memories was, it would have been like in grade school, like we were in like first or second grade.
Mhm.
We were living, at the time we were living in Pennsylvania, and we had a school field trip to Valley Forge. What you're thinking to yourself, what does that have to do with comics? It has everything to do with comics, because mom had given me some money for food, and I remember we went into this little like this little Valley Forge Museum store or whatever, right? Just a little store on the edge of the compound, and um, all sorts of little hotkeys and stuff like that, and in the corner was a wicker basket with just comics in it,
Mhm.
and they were old comics. And I didn't even, but it didn't occur to me that they were old comics, right? And they were just, whatever was there was new to me.
Mhm.
And so I bought a couple of them, and they charged cover price, which is significant because these comics were from the 60s. So I could actually get like a little pile of comics, and they were Legion of Superheroes.
Mhm.
And that
Mhm.
was Legion of Superheroes were one of my first loves, as far as like where it's Legion of Superheroes, and then also Uncanny X-Men, where I started to realize, oh wait, there are that I made that transition from comics were something that mom would occasionally read to me, to understanding that comics were a world in and of themselves with characters and continuity. That's when I started to realize that. And Legion of Superheroes, especially, what I remember most is that they seemed epic to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, so I bought Legion of Superheroes. I remember bringing them home, and then you know mom would read comics to me. I would like nag dad, and dad would. I remember dad mom would buy me comics at the pharmacy. Dad would buy me would during halftime of the football games. We'd drive out, and he'd buy me a few comic books, okay, on Sundays. And then as I got older, um, mom and dad would not read me my comics on demand.
Mm-hmm.
So I did what any sensible child would do, and I locked myself in my bedroom for a couple weeks during the summer, and taught myself how to read, because I was
Wow.
a spiteful child. Um, and I came out of my bedroom. I was really excited because I won.
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
read all by myself, and I really got them. They got to feel really bad for themselves, because now they can't read. They don't have to. They can't read for me. I can do it all by myself. I win. And then I think it dawned on me several years later that they were laughing the whole time.
Yep. Yep.
But we moved around a lot, but one of the moves, we were in Cincinnati, and dad was running a recycling plant, and I used to go into work with him on the weekends, and it would be a combination. I'd do some homework, and then the plant wasn't far from a comic shop in downtown Cincinnati, so dad would drive to the comic shop, pick up a stack, so yeah, so for me it was always comics. I created my own characters. And part of the reason I created my own characters was because I didn't see a lot of characters that looked like me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then in middle school and high school, I remember I fell in with some other kids, and we used to play Champions, which was a superhero role playing game.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always making new superheroes, and all my superheroes were black. you
Yeah.
know um and I was drawing, and yeah, just over time, what happened is, I ended up going to college, but I'm still reading comics. And that was this is at a time when comics weren't cool.
Right.
And so I remember, like I was the kid who even though I did well in sports, I'd be like, we'd be on the van or the bus going to the cross country, or the wrestling meet or the track meet, and I'd be like reading my comics, and the coach would be looking at me strange. Um, and but I went to college,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
there was not an opportunity to major in comics. I started out at a small school called Adams State College, now Adams State University, and I did editorial cartoons, and I even had like a little comic strip that I did for their newspaper. And then I got some awards for that, and then I transferred over to Oberlin College. Um, and again, it was like I would do like just different types of art stuff. I actually helped restart the Black Student newspaper, and so I did comics for that, as well as editing. um, I encountered a professor. Her name was Linda Grimm. She was an archaeology professor, and it was interesting because um, I fell into archaeology and anthropology because I showed up at this school. Obviously, there's no comics major at this time,
Mm-hmm.
and um, and I just had this curiosity, and I was like, I'm going to take courses and things that I haven't really heard of or I know very little about, just to figure out what I want to do. and it was my sophomore year. And that economics class just kicked my ass.
Right,
you
right.
know? Um, that anthropology and that archaeology class, especially that archaeology class, that I was like, why am I taking this? I just excelled. And she also gave us a lot of room to do different types of projects. And I remember what she did, but I remember she pulled me aside and she said, we're starting up the archaeological studies major. You'd be one of the first. But I want you to really consider it. And I was like, well, I this is one of those moments where I was probably too honest. I was like, I really love like a lot of the readings and stuff we do for the class. I said, but I gotta tell you, the idea of sitting in a 4x4 cube and 4x4 square and digging just sounds like hell to me.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And her response was, I kind of figured that about you because she knew that I ran cross country and track, and she knew that she could see that I was a pretty hyper kid. And I had done she knew I did a lot of artwork and I had done some stuff for her class. She's like, I figured that out about you, but this is what I was thinking. She's like, you know what archaeologists hate doing? Map making, survey work, and illustration.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
You can focus on that. And I was like, I can. And so I went on an archaeological field studies program for the summer. It was really great. I got a chance to see what it was like to do that. I really loved it. I came back and I was and when we planned out what courses I was going to take, I was only like 2 or 3 courses away from getting a second major in anthropology. So I got the second major in anthropology. Um, you know, um, so again, now you're starting to see, like, little did I know
Uh-huh,
this
uh-huh.
other major that I didn't really have as my main focus would actually end up being what I become, right?
Yeah.
So after I graduated, or actually at at graduation, I went to and also to Bruce Simonson, who was my other archaeology advisor. Um, Bruce was really, really interesting. He came from a family of geologists, um, and um, and he had an older brother who was kind of the black sheep of the family, because he didn't quite go into the family business. And so I went to Linda and to Bruce, and I said, "Thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for helping me get out in 4 years. Um, I'm not opening another book ever again. I'm going to become a cartoonist."
Yeah.
And they both looked at me and laughed. And Bruce pulled out a piece of paper. He wrote a number on it, folded it, gave it to me, and he said, "Oh, okay." And so the number was for Bruce's older brother, the black sheep of the family, who was actually accepted into a doctoral program for paleontology, who took sort of a left turn away from paleontology and went into comics, and that was Walter Simonson.
Wow,
Um,
wow.
so
Yeah.
so yeah, so after I graduated, I met Walter. He took me around the Marvel's offices, and he had a meeting. So he had me sit in a room in like one of the offices with his friend Chris Claremont.
Hmm,
Um,
hmm. That Chris, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I was just completely blown away by all this, and I'll never forget, like when I met Chris Claremont. What was really interesting is he asked me so many questions, and what was important was that I couldn't articulate it at that time, but I realized later that what was so significant about that meeting was I felt seen.
Hmm, hmm.
And we don't talk enough about what it means to feel seen and regarded, especially if you're from a marginalized community and you don't necessarily feel that like that space is welcome to you,
Hmm.
right? Walter also, invited me to his house, and I got to meet Louise, and then you know that was the summer after I graduated. I bounced around a little bit. I ended up doing some work at some museums, doing some just doing some teaching, and I found myself working a corporate job so that I could teach museum stuff to kids on the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So that lasted not very long. I quit that, or actually my parents came in. My dad flew out to Pittsburgh and was like, you know, you don't have to stay in this job. And so I went to Portland, Oregon. It was like, I don't know. I went to Portland, Oregon because I didn't want to go to New York, and Portland, Oregon has a comics community there.
Hmm.
And Walter had Walter had given me contact information for this guy in Portland that I should meet. His name was Bob Schreck, and
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
so Bob was incredible, and he introduced me to one of my all time fan favorites, Matt Wagner.
Yes,
um,
yes.
and so like while I was there, I ended up I was like, what do I want to do? And one of the things I did was I put together a proposal to do a comic strip that was going to be folk tales from around the world.
Oh, uh-huh.
And it was all set up where it had this little, like, it was like 3 panel format with a fourth panel that would be like a little graphic showing what part of the world it came from. And I remember showing it around, and one of the places I showed around to this one local paper in Portland. And the editor who looked at it was like, "Oh, folktales from around the world. That seems more like a niche market to me." How folktales from around the world became a niche market? Like I was like, oh. And then at the same time, I was, Portland isn't known for having a lot of people of color,
Hmm.
and as a result, the few that are there, they hear about one another. And there's this guy that I was told that I needed to meet up with. He's like, oh yeah, he's like, I was working at the Oregonian in their research library,
Hmm.
and one of my good friends was the music critic. He was African American, and there's this other guy who was kind of known amongst other reporters and stuff, and he was doing reporting and writing a little bit about movies for another local paper. His name was David Walker,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
it was like, and I remember I was supposed to have a meeting with him, and we just kept missing each other, right? So yeah, where was I? So okay, so I put together this comic strip, um and so eventually, as I was shopping the strip idea around, I stopped by the offices of a black newspaper called the Scanner, which is published in Portland and also Seattle. And the publisher's reaction was, he's like, "Oh, looks interesting, but we'll just take the black ones." And and so I was like, okay. And I was fine with that. Like, some people when they hear the story, they think, oh my gosh, you know, how dare he, blah blah blah. And he had some editorial restrictions and he had me do some things to remake it. And I never I used to say to people, it's like, I don't see this as selling out. I see this as me buying in,
Hmm.
because I'm entering with property that I own, right? This is mine. And yes, it's not exactly how I imagine it, but it was so close, right?
Hmm.
And so I was doing that, and this is at that moment where things come full circle. I was getting ready to go to New York, for a vacation. I was going to just swing in there for like a week. Um, and I was in touch with Walter. I was also in touch with Linda Grimm, and I had sent her copies of the comic strip. Now this is back when we didn't have, like, when it wasn't easy to just like send things. I remember actually like sending a hard copy to her in Oberlin, Ohio, and she called me and she's like, "Well." when you're in New York, you need to stop by some of the Department of Anthropology so that you could show the people whose work you're stealing. Because she's like, you're taking from folk tales that are collected by folklorists and anthropologists. I mean, she was joking, but her thing was that, like, you should see what anthropologists think about this.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay. And then, I remember like I hung, the phone conversation ended, and I remember like a couple days later, I came home, like there's a message on my machine reminding me. you know, I mean, Linda was great because she truly like invested in me.
Yeah.
And so what I did was, when I got to New York, I cold called the Department of Anthropology at Columbia, NYU, and also Temple, because I did like a side trip to Philadelphia. And while I was there, um, the receptionist referred me over to Michael Taussig,
Mhm. Mhm.
who, I don't know if you're familiar with this work, he's an
Mhm.
anthropologist. And so I literally just showed up at his office during office hours. This is like the most ungrad student thing to do, right? I show up and I'm like, "Hi, I'm Stanford Carpenter, and I'm doing a comic strip. What do you think?" She's like, "Why are you talking to me?" I was like, well, it's based on folk tales, and I just was really honest. I'm like, my professor from undergrad said I should, I just told him how I got there, and we got into this really interesting conversation about comics,
Mhm.
about what comics could mean for writing, writing about culture. I mean, just all of this stuff. Because one of the things he had mentioned, the For Beginners series, which I don't consider them to be comics. They're illustrated text, but I don't consider them to be comics. I was like, no. I said there needs to be a comic that doesn't have to explain itself along the way. And
Mhm.
he was really fascinated by that. It was one of those New York conversations. We started in his office, then we're talking as we're walking to the subway, then we're talking to the subway, and then we get to the dentist's office, and he's like, "I think you need to go." And he said, "But you should think about applying
Uh-huh.
to our department."
Yeah.
And I was like, "I should?" He's like, "Yeah, it could be really interesting." So I went back home, and I had, I think, like 3.5 weeks to take the GRE and apply for grad school. Um, and so I did that, and it was also really interesting because, like I remember, like Walter wrote one of my recommendations for grad school, and you know, by now I'm starting to have like a clearly defined like little network, um, and I got in.
Nice. Nice.
um, I went there. The person who ended up becoming, my main advisor of all people, was Patricia Williams, law professor.
Mhm.
She had come to speak in a class, and Mick was like, Mick Taussig was like, he had. Let me rewind. Mick Taussig had this thing in his classes where he wouldn't talk about a reading unless somebody in the class presented it. And she was a late addition to the class, and he was like, "Well, we're going to change the syllabus. I need someone to introduce Alchemy of Race and Rights, because the author is going to be here." And there's just dead silence in the room. Everybody was just like, "Woo-hoo-hoo," you know. And I'm like one of those people who are bored of silence. I said, and I thought I was helping out when I said, "Well, um, maybe it would be easier if, like, we had a sense of like what we're getting into, like how long is the book, how hard of a read is this going to be." And I remember he just looked at me, he's like, "Ah, maybe like 150 pages, big type, mate, you'll be fine. I got you down for next." So I had a lot of trouble with the book. It was just like, it was like I had to do it really fast,
Mhm.
and I focused a lot on the metaphors. And Patricia came to the class, and she got to see me present her book to her,
Uh-huh.
to the class, and then she had to leave a little early, and so after class, I like looked up her office. And I showed up at her office. And I remember like the first words out of my mouth was, "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Stanford Carpenter. I introduced your book a couple days ago, and I just want to say I'm really really sorry if I got it wrong."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
You know, and she was like, "Oh no, no, I've never had somebody talk about the metaphors, and I've always wanted someone to do that. It was really cool." And then
Oh,
she
nice,
asked me
nice.
about my work, and I told her about how I was doing comics. She's like, "Do you have any with you?" And I did. I had a few in my bag, right? And I showed them to her, and yeah, she just be. I mean, just over time, the relationship developed. She became my advisor all the way through to my PhD at Rice. She was like she was an outside advisor. Um, you know, you know, I, I, I continued on at Columbia. I knew that that wasn't the place for my PhD.
Hmm.
Um, I had a lot of support, but I didn't see quite the type of support that I needed to do what I wanted um, for a PhD. And so I went to Mick, and I was like, who do you think I should like reach out to? And and he gave me a couple of names, and I took a comic project that I had done for him. I made extra copies of it, and I just sent them to all the people who Mick named.
Mm-hmm.
Just sent out like 15 of them, and then I followed up with emails. It was like, hey, I was the guy who sent you this, and I and there's several faculty around the country who responded, and one of them was George Marcus at Rice University, and he said, if you're ever in Rice, you should stop by. And so
Nice.
what I do, my parents were living in California. I'm in New York. I was like, oh, I know what I'll do. So I did a layover in Houston, Texas, for Christmas, and I and I met George. I also met Julie Taylor, Steven Tyler. I'd sent my work to all of them, and they were all really intrigued. And then as I was getting ready to leave, I stopped by George Marcus's office, and he said, you should really think about applying to our program for the PhD. And I was like, okay. And this is George Marcus,
Uh-huh.
right? I mean, writing cultures project, the person who introduces postmodernism to anthropology, like all of this stuff. And I was like, okay. And so I did. And a month or so goes by, and I came home, and there was a mess on my answering machine, and I was like, hey, this is George Marcus calling. We'd like to invite you into our program. And I remember I didn't believe it. I was like, it was like one of those moody, really rainy days. I had walked from 116th to the Village. It was a long walk and I wanted to go to different comic shops. I forgot my umbrella, and it was raining on the way back. I was wet. I was cold. I'm listening to this message. I called in my roommate, um, and I said, listen, am I hearing that right? And he's like, Stanford, you got into Rice. I was like, okay. And so so I, I called George back, and the conversation it was actually a really short conversation. He was like, well, I know that you've got other applications out, and but I was hoping you can get back to us by such date. And I was like, well, I really just want to know, you know, where do I sign? And he's like, what do you mean? I said, here's the thing. Rice is kind of my first choice.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're the first people to get back to me. So all that's going to happen is I'm going to like tell you I'm going to my second choice. Like, you know, I said, I'm not convinced that you're real, so I want to know what I signed to make this set in stone. And so I went there. It was amazing for me. I mean, you know, I mean, I could tell you so many bizarre stories about Rice because it's especially the Times a very conservative school, but they very much invested in their students. My funding was set up in such a way so I could continue to be a working artist while I was working my PhD. So I did art installations in Houston. I became part of the Houston arts community. Um, so like you asked the question, I guess this has been the really long answer
Oh, you are
of
fine.
like of like how did I come how did you know sort of like how did I bring anthropology to comics? It was the like I said, it was the other way around. It was just I was really fascinated by a couple of things. One is there's a project in there that was very much about, me giving my younger self what I wish I had, which was more representation. But along the way, there's also in sorting out that question, I was very much thinking about well, as somebody who was flirting with doing comics as well,
Hmm.
starting to realize that the answer to you know there's the whole issue of like representation as it is, but then the answer why I realized was much bigger, and it was about more than just that it was about more than just looking at the number of images on a page, right? Um, in fact, it was really brought home to me, and you probably have to edit this and move it back. But I remember when I was at Columbia, um, I showed my comic to a professor,
Uh-huh.
and
Uh-huh.
she looked at it and she said, she's like, well, I don't know if I can help you with some of this stuff because it's clear that you're very much like in sort of the Pan-Africanist Afrocentric camp, right? And I said, no, I'm not. I said I said I'm sympathetic to the cause, but that's not really where my politics are.
Hmm.
She's like, oh no, 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 no. It's very clear from the work. And I was like, how can it be clear from the work? She's like, well, you've got like a very set format. It's a generalized African look. You're not really distinguishing between this and this. And I said, oh, I said, well, when I took this in to the publisher, it was originally 4 panels. I had a little thing for where it came from, and it was the publisher who came in and said, well, we're just going to take the black one. So a whole bunch of the stuff got moved to the side.
Hmm.
And I said, what you're describing are the editorial restrictions placed on me by the publisher of the newspaper. And then it turned into this weird thing of like, well, you should have about like how I should have resisted, blah, 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 blah. And
Hmm.
I was like, well, this was the choice. I
Right.
said the choice was between something and nothing, and so it was that was one of the early moments when I realized, and it actually had me look at anthropology differently because I was also, there are also lots of recommendations for you should be reading this text, you should be reading this text, and all of them, or okay, I won't say all, most of them, most being like almost everything, um, you know, really was doing content analysis of some sort.
Right. Uh-huh.
It was content analysis. It was audience or fan studies, right? And um, and to me that made absolutely no sense because I was like, well, like one of the cool things about anthropology is that it's one of the few disciplines out there that prioritizes your relationship with people over your relationship with books.
Hmm.
So I'm like, shouldn't we just like go out and talk to people?
Right. Right.
And um one of the early books, I mean, and this is a book that was written, like 60, 70 years ago, was by Horton's Powdermaker, where she actually talks about Hollywood,
Hmm.
and she
Hmm.
does it by actually talking to people who work in Hollywood.
Imagine.
Um, and it's actually a work that I cite. It's a great piece. And But that was never picked up on. Instead, we ended up with something different. And I understand sort of the etymology of it. Like you have this influx of British cultural studies, which is English based, and one of the things about the discipline of English is there's this long tradition of talking about the works of dead people. So
Hmm.
it's a different orientation, right? Um, Whereas anthropology has this long tradition of participant observation, where like you hang out in the village for a year, right? Um, but it wasn't getting I wasn't seeing it getting picked up on. So that is very much um, one of the things for me that as I went through Columbia, as I went to Rice, I became much more interested in like shouldn't we be going out and talking to people?
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, we are. I was like, we are anthropologists, right? you know, and um, and so that was why I did my research the way I did it. My dissertation research was looking at the construction of race, gender, and ethnicity from the perspective, in comics, from the perspective of comic book creators.
Yeah.
So I spent time, in studios, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
I spent time just talking to people, and even when I was doing it, I mean, some of the people were like, "I don't understand what this has to do with anything." But I realized very quickly that like if we're really going to talk about things like the use of stereotypes, um, you know, what are these? Why are different people represented in different ways? It's like, okay, so that's a question of source material.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know, one of my early questions was, well, if we everybody agrees there's a problem with representation. Like it's not like if you went to a comic creator that they didn't know that there was a problem with that. We're dealing with smart people,
Hmm.
and so I'm like, so why is it that we're still seeing the replication of these things? So to me, that pointed to something that was systemic, something that was embedded in creative processes,
Hmm.
and that's why I did the stuff that I did the way I did. And I still continued to. I didn't work in comics so much, as I went through a phase where I was working more in doing comic related work in fine art spaces, because I didn't. It's really hard to interview people and get them to like disclose their secrets,
Right.
when they feel that you're competing against them in any way.
Right. Right.
So that was why, like, I kind of moved away from comic books per se, right? You know, um, it's just that's just how it turned out for me. It's never been something where at the beginning of this journey I was like, this is what I was going to do. It was always, I have this question,
Hmm.
you know, I have a question. And then next thing I know, it's like, okay, now I'm here.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Um Now, even as all this was going on, I did continue to work summers as part of as a map maker and site illustrator for the Maroon Heritage Research Project, which was a series of archaeological digs tracking settlement patterns of maroons.
Hmm.
Um, so for me, it's really been about the question first and the activity second.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
but I also found that one thing that would like when I reached a point where I completed all of my coursework and I was about going into the field, um, I got a fellowship at the Smithsonian, and so the Smithsonian actually ended up bankrolling much of my like field work, right? Um, and that was a really interesting place because I was put in folk life, and they are the unit that also has that also does all the recordings of folk music around the world.
Oh, interesting.
So
Yeah.
so they have it. And why would a comic guy be there? Because they had a tradition of going out and talking to people.
Right.
So again, it was just this thing, in some ways what I did and what I do is it's very simple, but it's a simple thing that most people don't do.
In a very careful and methodical way,
Yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah.
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 Now I think what now I'll add this. More people are talking to creators now than they were when I was doing my dissertation research. I mean, there's been an explosion of that, but that's really within the past 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, um, so yeah, so that's my long-winded answer to you know,
The work in the path. Yeah,
yeah.
it's fascinating. It's fascinating. If I'm a listener out there and I want to maybe find some resources that you would recommend, both from your work as well as anyone that you would sort of nod to, are there a couple of places that I might go to check some threads out and explore some ideas from what we've talked about?
Well, okay, so I mean, as far as anthropology, I would Horton's Powder Maker, The Dream Factory.
Hmm. Hmm.
That I got her book right. I'm sure I have that book back there somewhere. Um, you know, her book it's an older book, and it's one of those things where she was a first. Zora Neale Hurston.
Oh yeah, yeah. My class is reading her right now. Yeah.
I would recommend her work. Um, you know, um, I think that for me, I mean, um, George Marcus's hmm, which, well, most people would, if you say George Marcus, it would be the Writing Cultures Project, which I think is really important. Um, I would put in a plug for Ethnography Through Thick and Thin,
Hmm.
and it's not just because I did illustration work for it; it's why I did illustration work for it. So
Yeah.
I used to. One thing that was interesting at Rice was the tenured faculty outnumber the incoming class of graduate students. Like, it's a very small department, so it's a lot of one-on-one. There are a lot of one-on-one experiences, and I used to joke about like the office where we had all of our boxes. I called it the den of time suckage, because you'd always walk in there and you'd always get caught up in an amazing conversation, right? But then you'd
Yeah.
wonder where the day went.
Right. Right.
you know, um, you know, I was fortunate as a grad student where like I would have like bi-weekly meetings with different faculty where like I actually remember some of my faculty members by what we drank.
Oh
you
wow.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
like like with George, it was usually like coffee early in the day. With Ben Lee, it was like a lot of times it was like a beer at the end of the day.
Right.
With Julie Taylor, it was like she and I had this little challenge where like we were gonna try all the top shelf margaritas in Houston. So margaritas, right? But it was just like, but it was very social, but it was also very rigorous at the same time. You know,
Yeah.
so for example, I'll never forget one time there's some reading I was supposed to do, and Julie asked me a question, and we're at a place we're drinking margaritas, and I didn't answer it. And I made this kind of, oh, that's just the and I didn't answer it properly, and I said, oh, that's the alcohol talking. And it was like the record skipped,
Uh-huh.
like her whole bearing changed, and she's like, no. And she said it really firmly, and like everybody around us got really quiet. And she's like, "You're at Rice University. We have a vested interest in you.
Uh-huh.
See, when you leave, they don't care about you. In fact, a lot of people are going to want to not see you succeed.
Oh,
So
wow.
you don't get to let the alcohol speak. In fact, you have to be more articulate." You know, like she just read me down, and it went for a while, and I just got smaller, 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 and then she's like, "Now," she asked the question again. "I need an answer."
Yeah.
You know, and I gave the right answer, and then everything got happy again. But it was just like, but like with George, what was interesting was I'd gone into the office, um and I remember I was going through my stuff and I was dropping off comics because what I realized was that most of my professors, um it started as a conversation with three of my professors at the same time, and I mentioned Spider-Man.
Mhm.
And what I realized was each of them was referring to Spider-Man of a different era depending on the last time they read a comic.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
So what I did was I actually would go out and buy comics for my committee, and I put them in so that we'd all be talking about the same comics.
Nice. Yeah.
And they would read them. And so I was in there putting stuff in people's mailboxes, and I hear George's voice. He's like, "Stanford, is that you? Get in here." I was like, I remember going in. I'm like, "Whatever I did wrong, I'm sorry." And he's like, "Oh, no, no, no. I just wanted to ask you something." He's like, "I'm working on this book, and I have this concept, and I was thinking that maybe it would be cool if you like did like a cover illustration for it."
Hmm.
And so he asked me to do the cover, and I was like, "Yeah, that'd be really cool." And then I started working on it, and he was like, "Oh, I'm trying to do this concept of multi-sided ethnography," and I tried to do an illustration of it. It didn't work. I tried to do another illustration. It didn't work. He's like, "It's okay for it to be autobiographical because like I kind of see it in your work." And then we had all these conversations. And so eventually I did a piece, a
Hmm.
little comic of like me as a comic creator and me as an anthropologist and us being in the same space where future me is interviewing past me, and we're
Hmm.
both thinking of different things at the same time, and they kind of cross over, but you start to see all the weird ways in which perspective changes things, and you start to see different places, right?
Hmm.
And um and so um the piece got rejected as the cover, and then I was like, "It's okay, George, it was fun to work on." He's like, "No, no, 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 no." And so turn my he made them turn the comic I did into the frontispiece for
Oh,
the book.
nice. Uh-huh.
And then they took some of the elements from it and used that to have a different designer do the cover based on my work. So it was
Oh,
really cool to do it. But what was interesting was that was a moment where I really brought together kind of learning and understanding a concept
hmm.
through my artistic production in conversation with a thinker.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Very cool.
but the concept in there, the idea of a multi-sided ethnography about when you start using and making connections between places that you think of as being incommensurable, right?
Hmm.
And about the type of knowledge that brings out, I think that's a very important concept for people to understand. So my long answer, ethnography through thick and thin, not just because I got to do something in it, but because of what that concept means and what it means for ethnography. And it's also interesting because much of that book is about ethnography,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know, back to how it is that we talk to people.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
it is that how it is we learn from those spaces. Um, you know, I would you know, well, Patricia Williams' Alchemy of Race and Rights.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
You know, all of her work is amazing. And you know, I mean, that's another really interesting moment where, like, after I finished my PhD, I a friend of mine, John Jackson, who is he's a cultural anthropologist. Him and I were in grad school together. He is right now he's a provost over at UPenn.
Mm-hmm.
But he came to me and he was like, "Hey, I'm doing this book." He asked me if I could create a character for him for the book, and so we're going back and forth talking about these characters. And are you there?
I am. I think your
You're
image
frozen.
froze. You are also
Yeah.
frozen.
Well,
Oh, there we are. Maybe.
okay. I'll
Okay.
start all over again. So, um, a friend who I went to grad school with, John, his name's John Jackson. He is right now he's at UPenn.
Hmm.
Um, he asked me to do a character for a book. And the reason was because he had seen a lot of the stuff I had done when we were in grad school. So he was like, oh, it'd be really cool if I create an alter ego for him. So I helped. So I was working with him to create this character, Anthroman, for one of his books, and we had this conversation about, oh, it's so cool that we have, like, to make this. Is like, I was like, yeah, it'd be really cool if we got more people involved. If we had a superhero group. He was like, and he was like, yeah, that'd be cool, but who would we ask? I'm like, well, Patricia had said that at some point that she'd love to work on something with me, on the artistic side. And so I said, he's like, you really think we can get Patricia Williams to do it? And I'm like, give her a call. So I called her on the phone and I was like, Patricia, I wanted to ask you something. And she was like, what? And I was like, well, you could just say yes. Okay. Just, I was like, it'll be really fun. It'll be really cool. Just say yes. And she's like, what do you want? Right. And I'm like, I like it. And then I realized I hadn't told her what it was. I was like, I like it better if you say yes before I tell you. She's like, just get on with it. I was like, mad law professor, superhero. She's like, what? I'm making a superhero for John. It's gonna be Antho Man. You already know about my character brother story. And I was thinking that we can make a superhero group.
Nice, nice.
And she was like, oh, that'd be really cool. And then we reached out to Sherry Parks, and she created a character called Fierce Angel that she also ended up using in some of her publications. And then we also ended up reaching out eventually to Ben Vinson, who yeah, everyone did administration now but me. But he is right now he's president at Howard University.
Oh wow,
Um,
wow, yeah.
and So we created the mysterious Professor V. And so we created these characters, and while I was working on them, I was on the phone with Derek Robertson, and I told him about what I was doing. And um, he's like, oh, that's so cool, because Derek was a regular reader of The Nation, a regular reader of Diary of a Mad Law Professor, which is Patricia Williams's column.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one of the things that Derek at the time would do when he was waiting for pages to show up and he had nothing to do was he would make custom action figures, mostly Star Wars action figures.
Oh, fun, yeah.
So somewhere along the line, we ended up with a Mad Law Professor, Anthroman, Brother Story, Professor V, and Fierce Angel action figure. Like
Collect the whole set.
he custom made our custom made our action figures. But this was just, to me, this is what was always interesting, right? Um it was how do you do the work in different ways without thinking too much about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
So, I mean, we named our group Critical Front. Who created Critical Front? Well, I mean, John had an idea for a character. I had created characters before. Then Patricia jumped on, and I can't remember who had the idea for the name Critical Front. We actually did a series of readings where we created a Critical Front adventure with our characters, and I did like a cartoon slideshow, you know, of like our characters having their adventures that we would do as we did the reading.
So I greatly appreciate your time, and by means of a final question, I believe we were just going to briefly discuss current questions that you're circling around in your work, as well as places where people can go to learn a little bit more.
Well, okay. So as far as like current questions, I think for me, and it was something that really started to crystallize during the pandemic,
Hmm.
is really digging a little deeper into what it means for comics to be power fantasies.
Hmm.
And you know, oftentimes there's this argument that comics are white male power fantasies.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I kind of want to step back from that. And instead of saying they're white male power fantasies, to say they're power fantasies. We
Hmm.
haven't yet been able to see what a whole bunch of what non-white male power fantasies could be, right?
Yeah.
So I'm looking at it from that perspective, because yes, it's true, but there are so many things that muddy the water. You look at a character like Superman, and
Hmm.
you're immediately confronted with the fact that Superman was created by two Jewish kids from Cleveland,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So you've got this white. Okay, if you want to argue that Superman is a white male power fantasy, this is what's problematic about that argument is that you know at the time that Superman was created, being Jewish was not considered being white.
Right.
And a lot of Superman's whiteness is very much a Jewish kid's fantasy of what it would be like to be a white Anglo-Saxon male Protestant. So I jump from there, and it's like from that perspective, you almost have to look at Superman as an example of double consciousness for white folk, right?
Hmm.
So you literally have white people seeing themselves through the eyes of another. So I look at all of that and I'm like, okay, so let's step back and let's say that superheroes are power fantasies, and I believe that they are. I mean, it really is what would the superhero is interesting and very American in that it is an embodiment of power that is unfettered. It's not tied to this. It's not directly tied to the state or to religion. And even when it looks like it is, ultimately superheroes are vigilantes, and they may work with law enforcement, but they
Hmm.
are not law enforcement.
Right.
And so I look at it as constantly asking this question of similar to what we hear with Spider-Man: with great power comes great responsibility.
Hmm.
But in that question, it's actually a much bigger cultural question of what is the appropriate use of power. And so that's something that I've been exploring, and it influences how I look at something like David Walker's Bitter Root, which I think is one of the books that everybody needs to be reading right now.
Agree.
Um, um, you know, because I mean I say it in the back matter piece that I write that let's talk about Bitterroot as being amongst the blackest of power fantasies, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
You have a black creative team, a very interesting sort of rethinking of race through the horror genre, and that takes me to the other thing that's really had a lot of my attention is I've always been interested in programming that is kind of neither fish nor flesh, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so what it often entails is looking at like how can we do things differently to reach different audiences? How can we use popular culture, to allow people to get more interesting insights into the world around them. And this is something else that was very much tied to the pandemic, starting with two symposiums that I did with the Chicago History Museum. Both of them were virtual. The first one was Lovecraft Country. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
excuse me.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
so the first one was Lovecraft Country, and what we did is everybody was literally locked in, and this is towards the beginning of the pandemic. And so what we did was I got together with somebody who I had done some work before at a different institution who had then shifted over, and we were asking all these questions like, what can you do in this environment? So
Mm-hmm.
what we did was we started it off with a drone, and we did like a drone tour of the areas of Chicago that Lovecraft Country was supposed to have taken place in.
Well, interesting.
And then we did a series of panels. So we did one panel that was really talking about travel and sundown towns, and also specifically sundown towns here in Illinois, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like we started literally, we started with talking about Chicago, talking about Bronzeville, which is also where I live. Um, and then we went outside to talk about what's going on outside of Chicago. And then we from there we had a panel that was really about psychology, like talking about the whole psychology of that time. We had Scott, for instance, we had Scott Jordan from Illinois State University. He was part of that. He was part of that panel, and and it was just like transitioning. And then in the evening, or not the evening, the next panel we had was kind of an all-star panel, right? And that was more of a sort of a general sort of culturally focused panel where it wasn't so much that we actually had people who have defined opinions that were very different
Mm-hmm.
talk about how they felt about Lovecraft Country. Um, so that it was really successful. We had we had a live audience of just under 1,000, and we came back the next year, and by then we were still locked up, but people were starting to play around with coming out with masks,
Mm-hmm.
and we did it on Candyman.
Mm-hmm.
And the first panel started with people who are from Cabrini Green, which is where the first Candyman takes place.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were actually involved in the shooting of the film. And it was also really interesting because they talked about, what does it mean to have your neighborhood be front and center in this horror franchise?
Mm-hmm.
It was a really amazing panel, and it was really nice to get like some of the broad perspectives. But it was very much about community, and it was also a chance to also kind of have a little bit of intervention amongst us horror fans, to start asking ourselves these questions. What happens when your home is reformulated as a hellscape for popular culture?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the next panel was art focused. I remember we had Stacey Robinson on that panel. We also had one of the people who did the artwork for the newly released Candyman, the most recent one.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about sort of art, Candyman as inspiration for art. And then the next panel was Candyman as inspiration for education. And then we had a panel that was a black, sort of a black horror panel. What was really interesting about it was we ended up we ended up having all women on the panel.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a black female horror panel. It was just the black horror panel. And that's what was really cool. So we had Kenitra Brooks, we had Tananarive Due. It
Mm-hmm.
was it was a really nice panel. And then what we did was we didn't tell anyone that this was going to happen. We just asked everyone to wait in the virtual green room. And then we had our special surprise guest, and it was Tony Todd.
Very
Uh,
cool.
so
Very cool.
so yeah, so we did a quick interview of Tony Todd, and then after that, we brought the panelists out of the green room, and then let them ask questions of Tony Todd and turn it into a nice little conversation, and then we open it up to audiences. So that was some really fun stuff that we did. Now, what's been interesting is lately, it's been kind of a like, you create something, you see how it works, you kind of build on it. Done a couple other programs with Chicago History Museum. But what's been really cool is I just finished two programs that were classes at Illinois State University, which is about 2 hours outside of Chicago.
Hmm.
So what's interesting is that we set up the classes so that so they're 5 week honors classes, and they're basically film classes. We use film as like the center of the classes,
Hmm.
but instead of teaching it at Illinois State University, we teach it at the Normal Theater. The Normal Theater is a theater that was built in the 1930s. That's been fully restored. All the Art Deco touches are brought back. The lighting, the marquee is the same as it was back then, and the interior is the same with a few additions. Like the ability to also do like Zoom calls and smart classroom stuff on the screen.
Hmm.
But it's like being in one of those old movie theaters. And the beauty of it is it's owned by the city of Normal.
Cool.
So it's a
Very cool.
city-owned theater, and we're doing a honors college class in it. And one of the things we did with the honors class was we gave them an all digital syllabus, and we were able to make it free for the syllabus. And the reason we wanted to make the syllabus free is because we wanted the students to have to pay to see the screenings at the Normal Theater.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And the reason for that is that we didn't want it we wanted to do this in a way that didn't take the Normal Theater outside of its normal operation. So what would happen is so what was nice is like the students would come, and then the fact with the Normal Theater, we didn't want to take them outside of what they do, meant that we made the class open to the public.
Hmm.
So the whole idea was anybody came to the box office, paid for a ticket, could come into the class. And the way the
Nice.
class would run is we would have previews or trailers, right? But they'd be trailers that would be related to our lecture about the film that we were going to show. And then we do like it was co-taught by myself and Eric Wesselman, who's a psychology professor over at ISU. Um, is that we'd go on for maybe about 20 minutes, and then and in it we talk about, we also have the students ask questions about like the last film, and then
Hmm.
we would show the film. The first semester in the fall that we did it, and, it's a 5 week class. It was exploring the ethnogothic, using Black horror to look at race and culture. um,
Interesting.
and so that was really fun. And the whole reason why that got started actually was that Eric, or Dr. Wesselman, was 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 putting up a Facebook post about a horror class that he was teaching. He mentioned that they'd done a unit or a week on the ethnogothic, and it was the pandemic, and we were trolling each other. So I decided to like troll Eric by sliding into his comments, and I was like, hey Eric, like wow, that's really cool that you did that. You could have gotten some of the people. You could have gotten one of the people to come and be in your class who was involved in coming up with the term ethnogothic. And then and then his response was to go to the honors program and put in for the idea of doing a class.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, once he asked me about it, I was like, oh, now you really understand me. And then we got together, and we just really thought, like, how can we make this class interesting, different? We did a series of little podcasts as well. So we had a conversation with myself and John Jennings on the ethnogothic. We had a conversation with Victor Laval. We had a conversation with David Walker, and so the whole idea was to create this digital syllabus that just had all the cool things in it. We also John and I had worked on a book called or a graphic novel called Box of Bones.
Hmm. Hmm.
So we actually got the latest. We got book 2 of Box of Bones like digitally added to the syllabus, and it hadn't been quite released yet. So don't tell Bill Campbell over at Rosarium. Um, but, but so we put it in the syllabus. Just stuff like that that made it really a real sense of added value for the students.
Hmm. A
Um,
unique experience.
yeah, and then we had the class take place at the theater, and it was really cool. Like the first week, and we didn't think about this because the class was capped at 50. You know, um, if you have to like pay for a ticket and there's 50 of you, you can't do it at the
Hmm.
same time. So we actually had this line that went around the block because normal Illinois is it's not very big, right? But it
Right, right.
but it was just really cool. So we went out and took pictures. The sun was going down. The other thing that was cool was that ISU advertised this as a class.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, the normal theater advertised it as a film series.
Oh,
And then I created some branding graphics that we used both for the class and the film series, so they were linked, right? And that was how we got the community to come in, because they came in for the film series. The students came in because they were going to get credit for it as a class, right? So it was just a really great experience, and it was also just really cool to you know drive to a small town and watch the sun go down and see your class up in lights. You know, I kept
very cool.
saying that it's like wow, just imagine how much better the self esteem of professors would be if all of us for every class
Right.
had like class put up in lights on a blinking marquee. So we did that last semester, and then we came back this semester, and we did another 5 week class, film class, and we did it on blaxploitation films. And we gave it the title. Instead of We didn't want to put blaxploitation at the beginning, because if you don't know what blaxploitation is,
Right,
it can there's a lot of room for some pretty grim interpretations.
right, right.
So what we did was we called the class "Can You Dig It?"
Oh, nice, nice.
And so it was "Can you dig it?" And then the tagline underneath was exploring race and culture through the blaxploitation film genre.
Cool, cool. I love the just the innovation. That's so cool.
And it was fun. It was really fun. I mean, it was both classes were interesting in that we kind of end up with a 60-40 mix of students and community members.
Hmm.
And then the other thing is that the normal theater, they try to get like 25 to 30 people in the theater on a Thursday night, and that's when our class was. Well, if just our students showed up, we would meet that metric.
Right.
And that's why it mattered that we had a free syllabus and the students had to pay to see the screenings. Because at that point, the class is helping to support a community-owned theater,
Hmm. Hmm.
and the community-owned theater is bringing members of the community in as well. So it was a really fun thing to allow so many people to come together, right?
Hmm.
We're also in touch with ISU's Office of Civic Engagement. I mean, everybody was kind of getting there. Everybody was getting a little bit of credit. Now that was really nice. So it's been that, and then the other thing has been, especially in the last 6 months, there's been like I've had some changes that have allowed me to really redouble my efforts around BCAF, the Black and Brown Comic Arts Festival,
Hmm.
of which
Hmm.
I'm chair. And what's been really interesting is that it started as just something that we did during the Martin Luther King Festival in San Francisco. and then it got big really fast.
Hmm.
And then the pandemic happened, and during the pandemic, that was another that became another outlet for playing around with doing virtual panels and virtual presentations. Myself and Aaron Grizel, who is the director for the Northern California Martin Luther King Foundation, which is the umbrella organization for BCAF, we started thinking, it's like, okay, what can we do since we were not having a Martin Luther King festival?
Hmm.
And so now now we're in a position where after doing the virtual stuff that we did, now BCAF is making this transition into being part of a festival on Martin Luther King weekend,
Hmm.
but also sponsoring and supporting thought leadership within comics, through the creation of panels, and one of the things that was really rewarding for me was I was able to go to Aaron um, and NorCal MLK and BCAF um, ended up co-sponsoring our big end of class activity for Can You Dig It. So Can
Hmm.
You Dig It ended on a Thursday, and what we did was we brought David Walker out
Nice.
for that last class, and we actually brought him out for the day, and he did appearances in classes. He did. We had a little mini panel on his comics, and then we did a signing over at Graham Crackers Comics, and then we had him come to the class, and he did the intro for a blaxploitation film documentary that he had created, many years ago. And then after the film was done, or the documentary was done, we had a panel with myself, Dr. Wesselman, and the one of the head of DE&I for ISU, Byron Craig, and then one of the people who's the head of the film department.
Mm.
So it was one of those things where it was just a really nice experience. And then literally the next day, David and I drove to Chicago, and we had a reception and screening of the same documentary at the Chicago History Museum. And then afterwards, we had a conversation between David and Pamon Rami, and Mr. Rami is a gosh, he's done so much. He was actually in several blaxploitation films, among them The Spook Who Sat by the Door. He's
Mm.
currently teaching a film class at Loyola University. So and it was just really fun. I mean, so we had like this really nice conversation. Aaron flew out for it from California, and it was like a mini like David Walker Illinois tour. so so those are the things that I've been really focusing on lately is what are ways in which we can engage publics.
Hmm.
What are ways in which we could do it through education, but also through art, through comics. I'm still doing a little bit of art on the side, and I have some stuff
Hmm.
that's coming out shortly. So it's been, for me, it's really just been about looking at this medium that I've been a part of for so long in so many different ways,
Hmm.
and thinking about what can be done with it. What can be done with it that allows it to move across different borders that
Hmm.
we think of. I hate the term thinking outside of the box, but I like the idea of like creating these experiences that can bring different people together around ideas.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's cool. And it sounds like you are a very busy person. A very, well, sorry, it's been a long day. A very busy person indeed.
So, well, you know, um, there will always be time to rest later.
Right, right. True enough, true enough. Well, if I'm a person who's interested in finding out about some of the projects that you've mentioned, where would be a place that I might go? Social media, website, physical location, those kind of things.
I would say that honestly, I would say probably one of the best places would be my Facebook page,
Hmm.
because one of the things I do is I do post. One of the things I do is I do post a lot of these things, pretty much
Hmm.
all of them, as well as we've been fortunate to get media coverage for a lot of this. We got media coverage for some of our symposiums over the over the pandemic. We've got a lot of media coverage for the course and film series over at Normal.
Hmm.
So that's up there too. And what's nice about it is it just helps to memorialize the experience. And I actually love those things because it's interesting to see what happens when somebody from the outside comes in and sees what you're doing and to see what they think is happening, which
Hmm.
sometimes is different than what I think is happening.
Sure,
So
sure.
that's in some ways it almost becomes part of the process.
Yeah, yeah,
And I can also make links to a lot of the stuff available to you if you want to
yeah.
if you want to tie them to the podcast as well.
By all
uh
means.
so so yeah, you can the social media that I use the most is Facebook, um Threads, and Instagram. I still do some stuff with Twitter, now X,
Hmm.
but it not as much as I used to.
Yeah.
The best way to you can find me in all those areas, just the easiest way is just put in Stanford Carpenter. There are a lot of Stanfords and there are a lot of Carpenters, but I seem to be the only one of them combined.
You are the
Um,
combo.
yeah. And then the other way to look me up would be under just SW Carpenter.
Fantastic.
Letter S, letter W, Carpenter. Strung together as one word.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, Stanford, thank you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you for a rich conversation with so much creating and innovation and just all sorts of things. You've been very generous with your time, and apologies for the wardrobe change, but glad to have you back anytime to talk about comics and creating and scholarship and all of those things and
Well,
more.
thank you so much. It's been fun. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying yes. And may the creating continue, and certainly always interested in reading your work.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.